I think you could argue whether those assumptions, looking back, everything is hindsight. Monday morning quarterbacking is always the best, even if you're a Chargers fan.
Alrighty, folks, it is May of 2024, and here we are after the publication of SP 800-171 Revision 3 and SP 800-171A Revision 3 at long last, a process that has been taking place over more than a year. The latest major revision to a document that has existed now for almost a decade, and we couldn't be joined by anyone else other than the man himself, the great and powerful Dr. Ron Ross, yet again, most popular guest we've had on any episode of the podcast since we've been doing the podcast. Air horns, applause. We'll add the air horns in post. Yay. Dr. Ross, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's always great to be here. Jason, it's good to see you as well. And we have a lot to talk about today. I'm excited to be here. And before we start, it is Military Appreciation Month. And so I'd like to do a shout out to all of my current and former colleagues. Jacob, thank you for your service and for serving. Navy guy, even though we give the Navy a hard time. I got my Army shirt on today, but
yeah.
And my second shout out is going to be to all of the cybersecurity pros out there, professionals who dedicate their lives every single day to getting up and doing the heavy lifting. I always say that our job at NIST is the easy stuff. We just have to produce the standards and guidelines. The proof and the pudding is always in the implementation, understanding. And thank you guys for doing your part to helping the community understand what's in the documents and making it easier for people to implement, so we can all have greater confidence in protecting our critical systems and our assets that are so important to the nation's future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. So as people know, we've had the great honor and privilege of speaking to you at length in a couple of previous episodes, which we will link to below. Now several hours recapping the history of 853, the history of 800-171, the CUI program, as well as some pretty in-the-weeds details of decisions in both of those documents, how they all have overlapped and intertwined over the years. Today, we wanted to focus on, maybe like 7 or so things that have to do with 800-171 and 171A. In wake of their publication, maybe a couple of extra bonus questions. We just recently did a very high-level overview of our initial takeaways from the document, but we wanted to get your perspective on a couple of questions. Before we get into those, though, one of the things that I noticed that I think most people have noticed about the documents is that you guys have provided quite a bit of supplementary material with 171 and 171A this time, some external links, some extra documents, extra tools that I've used in my own analysis. So can you briefly tell us about what some of that supplementary material is, and maybe if more is on the way, more is in store in the future?
Sure, absolutely. We found that supplemental materials are really important to our community because understanding what's in the document, just reading the words sometimes doesn't go far enough, especially when you're looking at new versions coming out. What are the changes, the deltas, and what do all these things really mean? So we're starting to do this over and over again for all of our publications, but it's really coming to the forefront in 171 in the series. So the first one that most people will go to is the change analysis document, which really shows the specific changes that we made going from Rev 2 to Rev 3. Now, you're going to find in the process that we use at NIST, where you have multiple public drafts, you're going to see some new stuff coming out in the initial public draft. It may recede in the final public draft and may show up again in the final. It's kind of a journey getting to that closure. We start out with lots of public comments and we try to get narrow and narrow. So at the end of the day, we have a document which shows you, the one on the website now, the specific things that ended up from the original version in Revision 2 to now in Rev 3. And that really helps organizations because they're trying to, if they've already implemented Rev 2, they're looking at the delta. What do I have to do to get to that next level? So that's really important. The next thing up there you're going to see is the CUI overlay. Now, our design decision, which is driving this entire effort, starting in 2022 when we had the first call out for the comments, we've made a decision corporately based on public input, that we had too many frameworks, too many things out there to deal with. And so we made a decision to take the 171 and move it over time. We don't want to do anything that's going to be totally disruptive, because we know that how big of an impact it has on the DIB and other organizations who are using those requirements. Over time, move the document content back to the source where it came from, 853. And Jacob, you and I have talked about this on previous podcasts. Everything in 171 derives originally from FIPS 200 and 853. Now, with the new version in Rev 3, we've kind of set FIPS 200 to the side. It's still important, but we're now going back to the exact source controls in 853. So for all the right reasons, our customers in the public and the private sector will be looking at the same playbook now, the same language. And of course, that is going to be reflected in that CUI overlay. And over time, and I'm not sure which revision it's going to be, it'll probably be with revision 6 to 853 down the road, that transformation will be complete. You won't be able to tell the difference between what's in 853 and what's in the 800-171. It'll basically be an 800-171 cover, and you open up the cover, there's going to be a CUI overlay, and all the tailoring criteria will be there. It's the same way we build overlays for anything else in the federal government. It's a specification of a certain set of requirements or controls in this case for specific missions, environments of operation. In this case, it reflects our authorities that come from FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, and the executive order on CUI starting in 2010. That's what defined everything that's in the original 171. And we're very consistent as we move that, we walk that back into the 853. I believe, and I we don't know that this is exactly the case now, but I believe over time, this is going to be a much more beneficial way of conveying the requirements to our customers, because the specificity that was lacking in the Rev 2, where you have a very simplistic requirement, some of those came from FIPS 200, which were by definition simplistic. That specificity was actually hurting us, or the lack of specificity, I should say, because people can have different ways of implementing a very simple high-level requirement. We wanted to get down so there's less room for movement across that road, because the requirements do have a specific meaning, they have a purpose, and it makes it very difficult to implement and to assess those requirements or controls to see if they're effective over time. So this is a corporate design decision, and everything we do, to include the things like the ODPs. You can't move back to 853 without ODPs. We've already seen that in 172. And that kind of set the tone. We kind of exposed that concept in 172. And I know that was a very, very hot topic and we'll probably cover that later on. But those are here to stay. They're there for a purpose, and hopefully we can talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, that's the journey we're on. And we're going to see it through to the end. And I believe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I noticed one of the additional resources that is linked is 171 Rev 3 information on the CPRT website. Is that
right?
Is that a decision that NIST is moving towards, to have more of the content digitized and available online?
Absolutely. In fact, I didn't get through my whole list. The third thing was the FAQ. We've been collecting questions. Some come from you and your channel, the questions that you raise, and we get lots of questions from lots of sources. So we try to internalize those and create these FAQs, which can save you time and effort by just going to the FAQs. And if you can't get your question answered there, then we can handle it out of band. But the CPRT data set, this is a huge transition that Vicki started. She took over most of the FISMA work 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the things that is in her vision is to take all the content that we've produced under the FISMA project, which is the risk management framework, which is the 53 alpha, and transition it with other NIST documents into this thing called the CPRT, the Cybersecurity and Privacy Reference Tool. It basically takes all of the important content, requirements, controls, assessment procedures, and it puts them online so they're in the same place. This is one of the reasons why we haven't combined 171 and 171 alpha, because it's already moving that direction. If you go to CPRT, it's already in the same place. It's in the same location. And we can go into why even if we didn't have CPRT, we still wouldn't have combined them for other reasons, and I'll talk about that later. But that CPRT is a critical resource. There are different data formats too, JSON, Excel spreadsheets, and there's one that we're testing now that is not ready for prime time yet. It's an HTML version of 171 and 171 alpha. You can basically go to the web and you can see the whole content, not in a PDF, but in HTML format. So I just looked at it this morning. It is awesome. And again, this is going to define the future of how security standards and guidelines are developed at NIST. Almost, I call it near real time, because you can't wait 5 years. I was watching some of the podcasts the other day talking about, well, 871 was it's a 10-year-old document now, and even 53 is a 4-year-old document. Most of the stuff in 53 is still highly relevant today. We may in Rev 6 be adding some new things, but let's face it, the fundamentals haven't changed how to protect systems. You're still going to be using two-factor identification, authentication, contingency planning, incident response,
Right.
flow control, all that stuff. So that's the big news there. We also have an overview of the project that you can also see all the revisions, what we went through from first draft to second draft, how we ended up. There's a news article to just get you into the game if you haven't been following this big news story for the past 2 years and you're just kind of starting out right now. But so those are the supplemental materials that are up there now, and we find those are very helpful. If we need to add more, we can, and we count on you and the community to tell us where there's some information that's lacking or some understanding that might be lacking.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I've been using the change analysis information and the CUI overlay information in my specific analysis as well, to put information out in our blogs and our podcasts. So they're great resources, and they're definitely really great for being included. Yeah, on that note about people saying, well, the document is X number of years old, and so it needs to be updated. That, it's as if least privilege is any different than it was 20 years ago. I mean, there's only so much that changes when you talk about fundamentals like that. So I completely agree. But moving it online into tools like that's going to be really great. Jason, do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I just had a comment kind of on that. The document's 10 years old, but it still has those foundational things. And I kind of related to back in my day when it was time to get into college, you had to just score a certain score on the SAT or the ACT, right? As long as you get this minimum score, you're in. And over time, it's evolved because the need had to be there to, I guess, create the gap, right? So now you got to get this certain score on the SAT or ACT. Plus, you got to do a whole bunch of community service. And then you got to be in sports, and you got to do this. And I kind of think of it like that, is that what we're doing is we're snowballing what the base foundation needs to be based off of what we've analyzed from threats coming in, to at least get that base foundation of security practices in place, no matter who adopts the document. I just think that that's kind of what it compares to. I wanted to move into another question, kind of sort of like not, you don't know where you need to go, right? And you just talked about the future, unless you've kind of analyzed where you've been and what's happened and kind of learned from those things, right? So, the first thing that I kind of wanted to ask you is, in the more than a year of development for NIST 800-171 revision 3, what has NIST learned, right? Like from that process, was there anything that you went into it that you learned going through it?
We always learn in every one of these publication updates. I think what surprised me the most is that the number of people that count every control and every subpart and every determination statement. I didn't realize that those things, because frankly, we never count the number of determination statements or the number of objectives in the publication. We basically try to define the requirement and then develop an assessment procedure, and everything in that 171 alpha, that really was to help our customers conduct assessments. There was never an expectation to go through every one. Now, you can play the game with numbers, and I know that you guys have talked about this before, about how we never withdraw, or we sometimes withdraw very rarely. A requirement or a control goes away. They resurface in other areas. But that surprised me, how many people actually hang on every number. And, the number goes from 110 down to 97. Some people are really happy until they discover that those other requirements now been subsumed by other. But there's a rationale. The thing I wanted to point out to everybody is that this is not developing a guidance document like this with requirements or controls and assessment procedures, it's not like working with first order predicate calculus. This is not a formal proof. There's a lot of thought and analysis that goes into everything we do. A catalog starts out don't forget, this goes back to 2003 when FSMA first started. We started with nothing, and we came up with the risk management framework, the control catalog, and then the assessment catalog. And those things grew over the years, sometimes organically. In that process, there was a lot of overlap in controls that came out of that growth over the years. We tried to manage that redundancy, but you can never get rid of everything. And so I think that's the first thing I would say is that the numbers of things that you can count, those are sometimes not the best way to look at the way the material is being presented. For example, if we've got a requirement in 171, and let's say it's the one about least functionality, where you talk about ports, protocols, privileges, services, there's like 6 different areas. We could lump all those things into one assessment objective, or we could break them up into ports, protocols, services. The reason we broke it up is because we feel it's important for an assessor and an organization who's implementing that least functionality requirement to look at each one of those independently. And I'll tell you, the reason it makes a difference is you guys did I think it was at one of your conferences where Scott Goodwin did a presentation that I thought was one of the best I'd ever seen. It was talking about compliance versus security and how the difference in those two. Now, for me, the term compliance doesn't have to mean checklist. To me, compliance could mean following a disciplined and structured process, managing risk, and coming up with a good, solid program. That can mean compliance. But unfortunately, the term is morphed into a checklist, and people associate that with the static checklist. And then meanwhile, everything is happening on the dynamic side of the house and you're going down. But I think Scott did a fantastic job of showing that the real heavy lifting comes in the implementation. So you read a requirement, and whether it's a simple requirement or whether we've now broken it down into the 853 language, which is much more prescriptive in some ways because it's more detailed, doesn't leave a lot of room for wiggle room, and it also brings in those ODPs, which allows the flexibility that you absolutely have to come up with these tailored requirements that talk to your specific organization or mission or environment of operations. So all of that then is reflected in the assessment procedures. And we tried to be very faithful this time. If you're moving toward 853, then you want to be faithful to the 53 alpha because that's where the source comes from. And if you look at our high-level design objective of moving all of this work back into a common framework or language that's based on 853 and 53 alpha, then you're going to see those numbers of determination statements and those assessment objectives. Those are going to expand over time to make sure they're consistent with the things in 853 alpha. So that's the reason why you see 19 new requirements, and then you see 100, and I think you said 102 new determination statements or objectives. That's going to be a natural thing that's going to happen because we are trying to make sure that it's granular enough for the implementing organization not to miss anything. And then the assessors are going to have an expectation that's set at the right level. There's nothing, and I've been doing these things, I've been involved in the assessment world for over 30 years, going back to the common criteria and back to the old National Computer Security Center, NSA. And there's nothing worse than having a set of requirements, whether it's common criteria or coming out of 853 or 171, that is ambiguous, that can result in various different implementations based on how they understand the requirements. So the more specificity you can make, it communicates better with the customer, and that makes for a more effective implementation. And it also helps the assessors because they're not running around all over the place looking for stuff that surprises the customer's organization. That there's nothing worse than that disconnect. Nobody wants to spend money on an assessment if it's not giving them an ROI. You want to say, whatever I've done, I want to make sure that it's effective, it's implemented correctly, it's operating as intended, and it's supporting whatever policy I've chosen to support my organization. So There's going to be, there's probably over 400 now. Does that mean you have to use every one of them? Not necessarily. You get to choose, but most organizations, for the sake of completeness and in preparing for an assessment, 53 Alpha is really good at preparing for the assessment because it gets down into the cracks and it helps you understand where I might have overlooked certain things. And I think that's what Scott did a tremendous job, because he took the one example he used. I know I'm going on too long here, but this is an important point, is the IPv6 implementation. That was such a great example of how commercial products are delivered in wide open format for the most part, instead of having everything turned off and then turning on features as you need them. So in some sense, you've got to go back, and when you're trying to do least functionality, those different ports and protocols and services and capabilities may come wide open on a product because they want to give customers maximum functionality. Well, if IPv6 is delivered open on a system, and the adversaries know that most organizations may not be going from IPv4 to IPv6 yet, then that's a vector on getting into that system. And Scott took you through the process of what a red team or an adversary will do to get into the low-hanging fruit and often overlooked things that provide that entry in the soft underbelly of an organization. And then before you know it, they've got the credentials, they're escalating privileges, and they're off to the races. And that spreads throughout the entire organization. So many people think that 800.171 is, because it's not a complete set of requirements that reflect the total moderate baseline. And that was done intentionally because we've got to stay within our statutory and our EO lane, if you so to speak. But most people don't understand also that all of those requirements that are framed with confidentiality for unauthorized disclosure of CUI, about 95% of those support unauthorized modification or the integrity process. So you are literally getting a twofer when you do the 171. And make no mistake about it, and I think Scott said this in his analysis, if you do these requirements and you implement these correctly and you do them the right way and you make sure the assessors check the work, get the receipts, then I think you're gonna make it really difficult for the adversary to do what they want to do. They may get in one area, but they've got to get through all of your defense in depth. And that's what 171 really represents. It's defense in depth. And we'll talk about a couple of requirements later that are my favorites. But that's kind of an overview of addressing some of the things we've heard, maybe not criticisms, but just points that are being made about the number of controls, the number of requirements, how they get combined and all that. So
Scott is by far one of my favorite presenters at a CS2 that I've seen talk at different conferences. And I agree with you totally in kind of all the thoughts that you have with his presentation. I want to kind of stay right here, just talking about in the year development of this revision of 800.171, and really quickly, just to try to make up some time here, was there anything that surprised you guys along the way during your development, besides the fact that people count every control, how many disappear, where they go, the determination statements? Were there any other surprises that you guys noticed that kind of altered your pathway to the development of the document?
Well, the one thing that surprised me was the ODP reaction. And that was, we kind of had to go down that road. I mean, once you make the commitment to go into 53, you're not going to be able to eliminate ODPs. But I was surprised about, we had people that liked them and disliked them for different reasons. They're actually a pretty important part of finishing up and finalizing the requirements and the controls. They do give you some control over the specifics that are important. My favorite one is the backup, requirement or control. How often do you back up your system? Well, I can't tell. NIST is never going to be in a position to tell an organization how often to back up, because you could be in a military organization with data that is time critical. Those backups have to be done hourly or even more frequently than that. Other times you could go days or weeks before you back up the information. That surprised me. And of course, in the military, when you're trying to kind of find the steady state there, you fire one shot artillery over the target, you fire one under the target, then you come to a steady state. So you can see we had a lot of ODPs. I think there was over 110 the first time. We backed it off to, I think we reduced it by half, and then we came back because to compromise and reduce the number of ODPs, we had to insert one of my least favorite things. It's ambiguity in the words called periodically, which is just another way of forcing that problem downstream to the assessors, because they're going to be asking, what does periodically mean? So we said, let's pull this bandage off, and let's don't push this thing downstream. Let's put the ODPs in that we think are necessary. We did eliminate the ones that we didn't think were absolutely essential to making sure the requirement was well stated and it provided the capability. So we were able to kind of reach that middle ground. There's still a lot of them. And as you all have stated on your previous podcast, there will have to be an organization that's going to step up and take responsibility. It could be a joint organization that covers the entire federal government. If that doesn't happen, maybe the DoD will step into the breach and define them. But somebody who cares about what those ODPs are will have to define those. And look, nothing comes for free. If an organization steps up like the DoD and they define all of them, then everybody, who's a contractor out there who has different contracts with different federal agencies is going to get stuck with whatever was chosen. And so, but they are a necessary part of the requirement specificity. That did surprise me, the kind of the churn and the back and forth. But I hope we came to a steady state that, is kind of the trade-offs that we have to do to finish the document and make it the best we can.
As my dad always says, you're never going to please everyone. I think more people are pleased with this than that are not pleased. So a good job on you. Yeah. I usually don't hog this much time of the show, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to Jacob and let you guys get like really into depth about some stuff. But for me and for everybody, at a high level, like how do you think people should feel about Revision 3 as compared to Revision 2? Like, do you think it's a better standard?
Yes.
Or a better guidance document, right? I should say that. Better guidance document.
Right? It's not a standard. And again, we don't get influenced by the FAR, the DFAR. Those are actually organizations that are using their regulatory authority to bring our work into the fray, so to speak. I call that weaponizing a NIST document. We don't weaponize. It's inert when you get it. So yes, I think it was a process that we went through. What was your question again? I lost the thread in your question again. What was your specific?
Yeah, like at a high level, yeah. What do you think people should think about Revision 3 as opposed to Revision 2? And then, like, is it a better standard or a better guidance document?
It's clearly a better guidance document. Why? Because first of all, we brought it up to code with 853 Rev 5, which was, that document was done in 2015, had a couple of minor revisions, but the big heavy lifting came with the Rev 5 in 2020. So that was the number one objective, is to get it up to code. But it's a better guidance document because it fills some critical gaps. The one big gap that I think you all are very aware of, and in the DIB especially, is the requirement for external service providers to make sure that this information, the CUI, comes from the federal government, and we throw it over the fence, and it goes into a contractor's non-federal organization in their non-federal system. Now, what happens to it from there, either one of two things. Either they implement the requirements and they protect everything on premise, or they go to somebody else, like a managed service provider. The CUI can travel a long distance. We were concerned about what happens when that secondary movement happens and that CUI goes to another organization. So that new requirement coming is part of we had those three families: the planning, the system acquisition, and the supply chain risk management. And they were all important for different reasons. But that reach, that flow down of requirements now says that if you share that CUI with anybody else downstream, you not only have to make sure the requirements are stated just coming out of the 171. So it's kind of a recursion. You're passing those downstream. And you're going to have to make sure that that organization that is now processing, storing, and transmitting that CUI can demonstrate to you that they have gone through the heavy lifting and implemented those requirements or the things that you would have had to do on your side. This gets into the shared responsibility matrix. There is never a situation where it's only on one party or the other. It's always a shared responsibility of requirements and who on the customer side and who on the service provider side are doing their thing. But together, that shared responsibility matrix is your playbook, because that tells you who's the quarterback, who's playing tight end, who's in the backfield, and what are their assignments. And if you don't have that, you're going to have gaps that emerge. That's where the adversary compromises in the gaps. And we have to make sure those gaps are non-existent and there's a tight coupling between the handoff between these different providers and the people who are actually doing, handling the CUI downstream. So that's why it's a better guidance document. It covers things that maybe were overlooked the first time.
Yeah, one thing that I always reference back to in conversations around SRMs is NIST has had a long, for a long time, you guys have described the different ways that controls can be implemented, whether they are system specific or whether they are hybrid implementations
Right.
or they are completely inherited. And as it turns out, most controls are implemented in a hybrid manner. So, maybe something that the team can consider if you're going to release future supplementary information is maybe excerpts from the 853 material around hybrid control implementations and how that relates to
Yeah, this is
SRMs.
it's a really tough problem too, because let's take personnel security. That means something in the context of you're sharing CUI with an external organization, a contractor. So they have personnel security to make sure their people are good. But what happens when that goes to an MSP or an MSSP? Who are those people? Who are the sysadmins in that environment? And are they are we trusting people in that environment? So it's a really dicey problem, but it's got to be addressed because the adversaries will always find a way to get in when they find these weaknesses or the soft underbelly, I call it.
So, in defense of NIST and Revision 2, I think when Revision 2 was crafted, right, I think that the relationship and the role of the managed service provider was much, much different, right?
Oh,
much less invasive, right? It was more break fix. Let's come into your environment. Let's do this. We'll set this up for you. It's not that we are remoting in from 300 miles away and we are just your provider, or everything's in the cloud. We're managing the entire cloud infrastructure. So it's great to see that the evolution happened, albeit 10 years after the fact. But still seeing that evolution. But I think that the reason why that evolution happened is because a managed service provider means so much more now than it meant in 2014.
Yeah, I mean, some of these. I mean, just to add on to that really fast, some of these companies that are MSPs or companies that sell tools that are used by MSPs these days are billion-dollar companies, and that just didn't exist 10 years ago.
Well, the other thing that's critical, why I think this is one of my most favorite requirements that we're now focusing on, is because as you start to move, let's say the small and mid-sized businesses are using these MSPs or the MSSPs in a greater number. That becomes a high value target because the adversary knows that there's a lot of stuff in there from different contractors potentially. So it puts a greater burden. I mean, this is a single point of failure. There are all kinds of things I would say where we have to be paying attention 360 degrees around that turret. And this is a problem that is exacerbated because what people don't see we talk about all these things above the waterline. I use that metaphor. Below the waterline, where the hardware, the software, the firmware, and the systems are all coming together, the adversary is fully engaged down at that level. And this is why it's so critical that we manage everything the best we can above the waterline. Meanwhile, there's going to be a whole group of other people work on a totally different set of problems below the waterline. It's kind of like there are termites in the basement. You better get rid of those, or everything you do on the first and second floor is not going to make any difference. And that's the part that most people don't understand, why the below the waterline work. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about that if we have time later. Yeah. But that's critical now. But above the waterline is still the cyber hygiene. You got to bring your A game above the waterline because that's equally important.
Yeah, still, for all the Navy people out there, you're still using that needle gun to get rid of the rust above the waterline, not just below. So, well, to indulge in the counting of requirements for a moment here, just to recap so that everybody is caught up to speed. The number of requirements in Rev 3 has decreased from 110 to 97, while the number of determination statements in 171A Rev 3 has increased from 320 to 422. Using the change analysis spreadsheet that you mentioned earlier, you can filter for just new requirements. And when you do, you find that there are 19 new requirements and that the corresponding number of determination statements is 102. So it seems like the entire delta is made up of just those 19 things. I have a couple questions for you on this. The first one is, why did those 19 requirements make the cut for being included in the new baseline for Rev 3, and what are some of the benefits that come with those new requirements?
This process, as I said earlier, is not. This is not using formal methods and first-order predicate calculus to come up with an answer. This is a process that is based on, I call it trades-based decision. When you build a system in the world of systems engineering, there are all kinds of trade-offs that are made. You've got to build a system that's correct, and it's got to be able to put steel on target. So how do you do that? What kind of trade-offs are made? The same thing happens with us. We're looking at adding, first of all, bringing things up to code with the 853 Rev 5. So a lot of the things that appeared came out of that increase in requirements there, but they didn't all go in. We have our tailoring criteria, and you're very well familiar with that, with things that are CUI that we can say clearly relate to protecting the unauthorized disclosure of CUI. There's things that are federally, only federal in nature, and even some of those could be debated. And then there's the things that are not applicable, obviously. And then we got rid of the NFOs because we did make some assumptions. I think you could argue whether those assumptions, looking back, everything is hindsight. Monday morning quarterbacking is always the best, even if you're a Chargers fan.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Those of you out there know Jacob's a Chargers diehard and a Rangers fan. But anyway, Monday morning quarterback's always easy to do. But, when you look at these things, you clearly see the categorizations that we made, the criteria we used for tailoring. We can even go back and change some things. We did some of that as well. We moved some things that were CUI or were non-NCO previously, not related to CUI protection. We moved some of those in. It's about judgments you make based upon how the customers have implemented the change in the threats over time, things that have gotten more important, and you end up with a trade-off. And this is one of the things that, so those 19 were things that we felt needed to come in. And when you bring those 19 things in, they drag with them all of those determination statements. They just come as a package. And I think people wanted to have two things. They said, give us the 171, whatever you're going to update, do it, and give us a chance to comment on it in that process. I think we did a pretty good job of transparently doing that. And then also give us the assessment procedures at the same time you do that. That's something we did for the first time with this update. It was wildly embraced by the community. And people love to hate the 853 alpha.
Boy, do they.
They love to hate it, but I threatened one time to get rid of it because we had complaints about how big it was. And then I said, okay, let's get rid of it. And we got so much blowback from even thinking about getting rid of that. But at the end of the day, it's a process of using our 30 years worth of experience and judgment and trying to balance what we see are an essential set of requirements to protect CUI. And this gets into the ORC problem. I know, believe it or not, we didn't get a whole lot of comments on the ORCs. In fact, 99% of them came from Jacob, I believe, on the ORC. And so we took a close look at those. And I know people look at those and say, okay, well, what do ORCs really mean? Because in 853, we do have a list of, for every control, we have a list of related controls. And we have a whole paragraph in 853 that tells you the criteria that we use to select a control to be related. The ORC definition is uniquely designed for the 171. And here's how that came about. During the public comment process, we had a lot of people comment on the similarities of requirements in 171. So we took a look at each one of those and we said, okay, if we were to agree with the customer who said these two things are the same, is that really true? And so we started out looking at the capability that the requirement addressed, or the source control. And we found that there was, in some situations, now, Jacob, you pointed out quite a few, and we went back, and you probably will realize that some of those ORCs went away.
Yeah, some of them did.
Yeah. We did keep other ones because, again, this is a balancing act. We are trying to make sure that we do the right thing for protecting CUI, but we don't make it so difficult and overload the system where it implodes upon itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were some decisions made. I know the favorite one that you talk about a lot is the one about the component disposal.
See,
So
I was just about to say that.
I,
Jason
I
and I are going
told
to
you,
have a whole episode debating some of the
I,
dude.
you could
controls.
probably have a whole episode, but let me tell you that. Let me kind of preemptively tell you why that was not. We could have included that. It'd be one more thing to do. But if you think
Just
about,
go ahead and hold on, Ron. Just go,
yeah,
Dr. Ross. Sorry, Dr. Ross. Just go ahead and tell them that A, I'm right, and B, because the discussion kind of hints at the physical destruction and all of the supporting documentation points
Counterpoint,
to. Hold
discussion
on,
sections.
points to. Wait a second. Points to physical destruction techniques. That's why we didn't duplicate the control because things were already duplicative. I'll hang up now and listen. Long time listener.
Just to
Big
follow up
fan.
very quickly, discussion sections are not normative. It is an explicit note in the document that they are not
yes.
normative additions to the requirement. So it's not in the requirement. It's not in the requirement. We're going to have a whole episode, but please, Dr. Ross,
Yeah,
continue.
there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. They're very different things, and you can have the letter and the spirit. So in looking, what are we trying to achieve with the use of the MP control to deal with sanitization, which includes, if you look at the MP control, it does include the destruction of the information on the device. So if you look at that, that accomplishes the unauthorized disclosure part of that problem. Whether you bring in the actual component in the SR family is, yes, you could do it for completeness. And Jacob, you probably would sleep better at night, but it's just one more thing to bring in. So look, here's the bottom
Could
line.
you say that just a little louder for the people in the back? Just a little.
We made some decisions to balance the simplicity and not overloading the system with making sure we get the job done. And that's the trade space that NIST has to operate in. We have a certain charge to bring documents that are technically correct and implementable and doable. Now, some people could argue, well, 871 is a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but whether you're a small or mid-size or a Fortune 500 company, the adversaries don't care. You have to do whatever you can do to protect the information. And if you're in that situation, I'm sure that the big guys, the customers that are in the Defense Department, they have to deal with that situation, the cost and all those things. As you guys have said many, many times, we can't use the cost issue to downplay the capability, the protection. I mean, we could downsize the requirements down to where they're very affordable, but they're also very ineffective.
Right.
So if you have design documentation for the next generation submarines, or the next generation tactical fighter aircraft, and that stuff is in early stages of development, it's not classified yet, but that's intellectual property. That's what gives the warfighters the edge. So this stuff it's highly significant, even if it's way far down in the supply chain in that mom and pop organization. So that's a different problem. But our job is to make sure that we give you the tools to win. Yeah. And how you implement those tools is going to be another discussion for another day. And I'm confident that whether it's DOD or whether this thing goes into the FAR eventually and it's going to be across the federal government, we're all going to be having the same discussion. We can put our heads together and come up with solutions that work, that provide, I'll call it as secure as reasonably practicable. We've kind of gotten away from the term adequate security. Now we're using that term as secure as reasonably practicable. And that comes from NASA's term as safe as reasonably practicable. They launch astronauts. Is there a zero probability those astronauts are going to go and never come back? It's dangerous. Even with everything NASA does to minimize the risk to astronauts, there is no risk-free environment today, especially in cyber. There's no secure system. If somebody tells you their system is secure, turn it over to Scott Goodwin for like a half an hour and then come back with the receipts and then tell me it's secure. So it's all about assurance. It's trade-offs. It's evidence. It's proving the claim that you made and substantiating that with the work that you can do. So that's kind of the long answer to your short question.
Well, a note on just to put a bow on the ORC question, which is a whole rabbit hole. I look forward to the debate. Maybe we'll come have you moderate the debate at a future episode. My question about the ORC controls generally is that, as you've said, looking through 853, basically every control has other related controls. And so why were only some controls categorized as ORC when they're related, when others were
Yes.
not? Was this just a case by case
It
basis?
was case by case, and it gets back to that trade space that I talked about. Certainly in 853, if you look at like the access control family and the INA family, those are related because the INA is kind of the front end of the access control. You really can't have access control if you don't have INA. So there's a supporting relationship between controls. In fact, a lot of controls have dependencies. People think controls are individually implemented. In some sense they are, but they actually have a lot of relationships and dependencies. And you get a capability. Multiple controls can be implemented to give you an overall capability. So in the 171 discussion with ORCs, we tried to make the determination that the capability that requirement was addressing was more or less covered by the one that we said was an ORC. It was close enough to have the capability be there. We tried to show the places where those other capabilities would be articulated. We have a tagline that shows where where we got our receipts for making that decision are clearly there in the document. Now you could argue over whether it completely covers it or not, and that's a discussion that you could have. But again, it's a judgment. It's a case-by-case judgment, and you have to at some point you got to pull the trigger and go live, because the DIB is not going to sit around forever waiting for a set of requirements while the adversaries are crawling up and down our systems and eating our lunch.
Yeah, yeah.
So I kind of wanted to jump in, and you kind of mentioned, why some of the controls were withdrawn or merged and things of that nature. And I noticed that like several of the SB 853 control enhancements have been merged with their corresponding base controls to form requirements in 171, but not all of them. So why are some enhancements merged with their base controls while others are not?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, in 53, you really don't have the problem. You have base control, and then we just start building enhancements, and they grow over time. And that's kind of like the methodology for 53. In 171, it's a different situation. We go through there, and we broke everything apart, and we laid everything in Rev 2 on the table. Literally, we cut every requirement up, and we look at the source controls that we're feeding that, and we try to assemble a package that makes sense from both a technical perspective, but also from a customer perspective. So there's a lot of things that got merged. And Jacob, I think you did mention this. You actually had the right explanation. When we withdraw a control, it's for traceability over time for that number. No numbers ever go away because they never get repeated again. That's for traceability for contracts and for everything else over time. So we withdraw requirements. Sometimes they do go away, like VoIP went away. It just outlived its usefulness. But most of the time they're withdrawn and they're subsumed by other requirements. Or in this case, we tried to assemble a set of requirements or subparts, if you will, that kind of work together for the same overall objective, the same capability. Now, there were some that didn't get subsumed. And again, it's a design decision. You want to try to balance having 250 requirements, each at the token level, or combining things so they make sense for the customer. So everything we do was to maintain the technical correctness, but also think about from the customer's perspective. How are they looking at this on the other end when this thing falls out of the sky and they've got to now start the implementation process? Now, in fairness, you've talked about this. 171 has been around since 2015. There are always going to be a lot of things in 171 and 853, but these things just didn't drop out of the sky yesterday and you're starting your security program today. This is a recognition that security programs should have been started decades ago. You don't just take everything and expect to implement everything in one day. It's too much for anybody to do, but you should be over time building that capability up family by family, control by control. There's a build out process, but it's the foundation goes in and then the next level goes up. And over time, so when we put out a new update to a publication, it's not like starting from ground zero. You're starting from whatever foundation you had. Now, unfortunately, we found out that foundation might not have been as strong as we had anticipated. And that's why the NFO controls went away and we made it more explicit. Now, does that cause pain and suffering? only if you never did the NFOs and you didn't have that strong base. So, and this is not criticizing. Believe me, I know out there people are busy. They're running their companies. The margins are tight today because the costs are going up and it's hard to run any business today. Yet the one thing that we do know is that if you have a kill shot cyber attack, it can take down your company. Let's forget about the div for a second. Let's forget about CMMC. Let's say you're just running a company out there and you have your own intellectual property. How long do you think it's going to take for you to recover and get back online while your competition buries you because you've been offline for a week or 2 weeks or maybe forever? Companies can't afford to go through that. So yes, everything looks expensive when you're looking at the entire catalog in one day. It's sticker shock. But that should be kind of this is like you're adding on to an already established base. And if you're not, then it will be sticker shot. There is going to be some heavy lifting done. And there's going to be some pain and suffering. But once you go through that and you establish that solid foundation, the deltas should not be all that great. And I think you all have talked about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, after 15, 20 years of a cyber arms race going on, if you just show up one day and get started, then
Right.
the hurdle is bigger than it was 20 years ago, just like,
Absolutely.
just like any industry. So a couple questions here towards the end about maybe what the future holds, a couple different perspectives on that. You've mentioned before that the revision to 171 was triggered by the revision to 853, and since it's what I call a derivative of 53,
Right.
that revision process trickles down. Do you anticipate any additional revisions prior to the mythical 853 revision 6 in the future?
No, I don't think so. I think, of course, Vicky Pillateri now is leading this effort. She took over the FISMA work almost 3 or 4 years ago now, and I agreed to work on these 171 updates as kind of like this is going to be my final FISMA contribution. The last two documents are coming up now, 172 and 172 alpha, and then I'll be moving full time below the waterline with the engineers, trying to figure out how we can do battle below the waterline. So, yes, those documents are going to round out the series. I wouldn't expect that before Rev 6 comes along that there would be that final CUI overlay movement because, look, we also have to balance how much churn does this have for the community.
Right.
You don't want to have so much churn that it's counterproductive. So let's absorb the Rev 3. There'll be some time. Rev 6 for 53 is going to look a lot different now because a lot of those updates are going to go online. That document development, you may never see another PDF with other than chapters 1 and 2. All the controls might be up in the CPRT. That may be the way we update the document in the future too. So there's a lot of dramatic good changes coming. But 172, different document, enhanced requirements based on the solid foundation. Now, what I can tell you is that everything in 172 is going to start with what's in 171 Rev 3 and build out from there. So we're going to have to figure out what's in the current 172. I can tell you this for sure. There's going to be more requirements there than you would expect. And that's not because it's not an all or one and done. It's an a la carte catalog.
Right.
This is it's important to have a sufficient level of requirements that talk to these critical programs and high value asset customers. You've got everything from the DoD designing and building next generation weapon systems. We have NASA, launching satellites with all the intellectual property that's involved in that whole world. And so you can count on the number of requirements to grow, but it'll still be they're optionally selected. And so that'll be probably a contract by contract. And I would expect on those high-end programs and contracts, you're going to see a lot more of those enhanced requirements. So our job is to make sure that catalog pulls everything out of 53 that we think they will need to do battle with these adversaries in the non-federal space. And that's growing. That supply chain is getting big and deep and wide.
Right.
We've got to make sure. So that's the 172.
Well, just really quickly on 172, previously you've talked about how you expect that the draft, comment, and final publication might be done by the end of this year. Is that still roughly when you're expecting to see it?
A lot of this depends, and we've always said this. One thing I will tell you is if we make a statement about when we're going to deliver, we don't do that unless we have a 95% confidence interval.
Oh, we
And you
know.
guys are
Oh, we
always
know.
very close.
Oh,
We
we
always
yes,
give the
yes.
applause to NIST. You guys are very good about setting an expectation and then coming extremely close.
For one thing, as far as looking at the dates, I think you were talking about the end of the year. I think it depends again on how many comments we get on individual. Now, what I can tell you is we're going to use the exact same rollout strategies we did with 171. You're going to see 172 will appear first without the 172 alpha. Why do we do that? Because we want some steady state before we start to build the assessment procedures. So the initial public draft will come out first of 172. The final public draft of 172 will come out with the initial public draft of 172 alpha. I like that model because it allows you to see both things at the same time. We don't need a final draft on 172 alpha because once we lock the requirements in, for us, it's just a mechanical process of making sure they're consistent. So the end of the year, if you give the organizations a sufficient amount of time to review these documents, and one of the things that comes into our equation is how much time do people need to do this? In other words, everybody's got a day job, and we're asking them to look at this stuff out of band, right? So we want to make sure that we give people enough time to thoughtfully weigh in, provide their feedback, for us to have enough time to thoughtfully analyze and not just say, oh, let's blow by this one. We look at every one of those comments. And so I'm thinking now, realistically, we're looking the first quarter of the new calendar year, sometime I think between January and March. And as we get closer, we talked about that great funnel. We start wide and we get narrow, and you can see the document taking shape as you provide comments. We will be speaking about tightening that shot group up, so there'll be no surprises. But I think we're still going to be out well before. And Jacob, you know this better than anybody, the rulemaking process. You've been talking about all the different rules coming out. I think we're going to still be there. We want to be there when the executions happens for our biggest and our most important customers. And that could not just be the DoD, that could be almost any federal agency. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I think that process of initial public draft into final and initial for the requirements document and the verification procedures document is a great approach. I think it kept a nice steady heartbeat and cadence through the development of 171 Rev 3. So I think using that pattern for 172 is a great idea.
Yeah, I think this is, and again, this is kind of a bittersweet time for me because this is like a 21-year journey for me, and I've absolutely loved working with our community out there, all of our people who've been part of the public review process, and how just this community, it's got such grit to it because there is no job that's more important, that's more central to doing it well, because the stakes have never been higher. And the people out there in the community, I just take my hat off to them. I give them a 21 gun salute if I could. And I'm going to miss that. But there's also important work going on with our engineering community. They are really down there. That's where the hand-to-hand combat is, below the waterline. And it's not pretty. And we got to get down there and engage the adversaries before it's too late. And there's going to be a lot of things that we'll be publishing in a different series. The 800-160 is the engineering series. We're going to talk more about assurance cases. And that, by the way, that's not unrelated to the 171 alpha. Assurance cases, evidence.
100%.
Bring the assurance receipts and let me know you did what you said you were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely.
So we're talking about timelines a little bit, Dr. Ralston. I was wondering if you could give us any idea on the timeline of when the 853 revision 6 process would begin. I just want to know for planning purposes. So you told me I got to mark off January to February for any vacations, and I just need to know when Jacob's going to disappear for 3.5 months into a dark cave. Okay.
I'm going to leave that question to Vicki because she's now we call it the SYNC in the military. She's commander in chief of that whole effort now. So I'm going to leave that one to Vicki. She's got a lot of parameters that come to bear when do we start to actually go seriously down that road. And it's going to also have to be in conjunction with the automation work that we're doing now, all of that stuff. So, it's unclear when that's going to be, but there'll be a lot of factors. The threat space changing, different types of controls that are needed that are not there now. All of that stuff has to be developed, designed, tested, kind of socialized with the community. But we've got the best people out there, and when the time comes, we'll be there to slide down the pole and make sure it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess what my last question here is maybe the largest in scope of them all. So, as we've talked about many times, as you mentioned earlier, 171 is really designed to be this baseline across the federal government for protecting CUI in all of the federal supply chains, not just the defense supply chain. And the missing piece of this whole process downstream from the CUI executive order was the FAR CUI rule that would put this requirement to implement 171 into all contracts. We've only had it in the DFARs for DoD
Right.
contracts. As the FAR CUI rule now seems to be emerging from its long multi-year slumber, and as 171 has gone through its revision process and got more attention, have you guys seen? Have you been pinged? Have people been reaching out to you from other federal spaces besides just the defense space with questions about it, curious about it, how to adopt it, getting familiar with it? Has there been other conversations between NIST and these other agencies?
We haven't had too many conversations. Again, as I say, we try to keep ourselves separate. Our job is to develop the best technical standards and guidelines we can, whether they're implemented or called out in the FAR, the DFAR, or the moderate baseline. When NARA first started this effort back a long time ago, as you say, when the kids gather around the fireplace, it has a whole history there. So when anything NIST does is called out in a law, a regulation, or a policy, it becomes real for a lot of people. So, but we wouldn't change anything we would have done in this development process, because again, whether it's in the FAR or the DFAR, it just has a wider reach. And I can tell you, the FAR and the DFAR have a lot of spillover, not just in the contract. It becomes kind of a de facto set of requirements across sometimes across industry, and even internationally. I've given had a lot of meetings with the Japanese and people in the European community. 171, it's surprising where this document has gone and the reach that it has. So we just want to make sure we keep our eye on the target. And I think one of the big things that's going to happen, you brought this up a lot on a lot of occasions with the ODPs. There's going to have to be some kind of a process. I don't know, Vicki may have some more information on this with working groups that she might be working with to try to establish some kind of a process where the ODPs that matter to the organizations across the board that they can agree on, set those, establish those. And if you don't care about them, then pass them downstream and let people decide. That's the way it was always intended to be, because, and I know people would have loved it for NIST to do that, but I guarantee you, if we would have told you that you had to back up your systems every 2 hours, we wouldn't have been too popular right now.
Right. And to the point, for all the federal listeners out there, for all the agency people who would maybe participate in that working group, if you do your homework, the tailoring list in the appendix of 171 Rev 3 will show you that the 853 control for tailoring requirements, defining ODPs, is the last step in tailoring requirements, is tailored as a Fed control. This is your responsibility to define the ones you care about and then pass the ones you don't care about to the discretion of your contractors. So,
well, I think the other thing I would just mention in closing is that we heard a lot about the fact that 80171 alpha, a lot of people didn't even know it existed. So we really made a point in 171 of highlighting the fact that's an important publication. And in fact, we did take a lot of material from 853 alpha on assessments, how they're done, why they're important, what kind of comes into play. So all that information now is in 171 alpha. So you should see a greater synergy between those two documents, which I think is important and something we really wanted to do based on the community input that we've gotten.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're not getting your single document, Jacob, but you get a flashy HTML page.
And
okay?
we'll get there. We'll get there one day.
Stop asking for the Red Ryder BB gun, okay?
Well, Dr. Ross, I think is a new speed record for our episode, getting through the document. Of course, we've covered a lot of ground on the initial draft, the final draft, and our sort of precursor multi-hour conversation. Thank you for being so gracious with your time, as always. I know this has been a long process for the team. You have another long process ahead of you with 172 and then moving to below the waterline. Any parting words or additional insight that you'd like to leave everybody with now that 171 is done?
it's a lot of work, but it's worth the effort. That's one thing I would tell everybody. You know, the country. It's hard to overstate this with our total dependence on computing technology, going into everything from IT systems to OT, IoT, IIoT. Cyber physical convergence has changed the landscape for everything that matters today. So there is no higher calling. We know it's a lot of work. We know it's not going to be a smooth ride. There'll be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but you're still making forward progress. I would like to give a shout out. We talked to you about the military month, all of our folks that are serving the country, our contractors who are helping those warfighters, and a shout out to you and your channel, helping increase the understanding and the awareness, the level of detail of things that you have to go through and understanding the regulations and all of the documents coming out. Like I said, people have day jobs. They count on information to flow, and it's enormously helpful for not just your channel, but all of the other channels out there who are trying to help our community get through these difficult times. We stick together. We operate one team, one mission, protect the country. Again, thanks for having me today, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome. Anytime.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll see you in a couple
anytime.
months for 172. Thanks again, Dr. Ross.
Take care, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, Dr. Ross.